I'd like to do my usual summary of lost boats during the month. And then, of course, with my dad being the commanding officer of Trigger in its loss, I'll expand a little bit more with some show and tell. USS Perch, having served out of Port Darwin in Australia, she departed for her second patrol in February of 1942. Ultimately, it was in a miraculous survival of its crew. They only lost 8 ultimately. The account that came across that I want to read comes from the surviving commanding officer. On March 1st, the Perch sighted 2 destroyers and dove and thought they had cleared. Unfortunately, they had not. Ultimately, the commanding officer ordered the depth to be 180 feet. At 90 to 100 feet, the destroyers passed over and dropped a string of charges, and shortly thereafter, Perch hit the bottom at 147 feet. During the attacks, she lost power and on her port screw and managed to clear the bottom, but then the leaks started. They were able to get on the surface during the night, but then the enemy found them again and came on over. Her reduction gears were in bad shape. There was serious electrical grounds and broken battery jars. The engine room hatch leaked badly, so arrangements were made to scuttle. She was able to survive a little longer, but then, after another attack, the water poured in the conning tower hatch, the engine room hatch, the 3-inch circulating water line leaks into the hull. Nothing the crew did seemed to stop all the leakage, and they made various attempts to fix it. The gun was inoperative. The torpedoes could not be fired. The exhaust gases and nervous tension had built, and thus they were able to scuttle. At this point, all the crew was actually picked up by the Japanese ships, and they lost 8 during the subsequent years in prison camp. Just amazing. Everything broke, and they were still alive. USS Grampus, after departing on the 9th and returning on the 10th, it departed from Brisbane on its 6th war patrol. Once she departed, they did not hear from her again. She was ultimately able to team up with USS Grayback off of Bougainvillea, but then they were sighted as a result. The enemy afterwards they deduced the 2 destroyers were able to catch her, but unfortunately that was not ultimately confirmed because the destroyers themselves were sunk by Allied airplanes. USS Triton. On her 4th war patrol, it was lost in the Solomon-Bismarck area early in 1943. The last word from Triton was on 11 March 1943. It said 2 groups of smokes, 5 or more ships each, plus escorts and chasing, and then was ordered south from those points to try to catch that group of ships. Information available after the war was over showed that Triton was ultimately sunk by destroyers while chasing that particular convoy. Triton was the most active and valuable member of the submarine force prior to her loss. In total, she was credited with sinking 16 ships, totaling 64,000 tons, and damaging 4 other ships for another 30,000 tons. USS Kete, got that one pronounced right, departing Guam on 1 March. She was out on patrol and had orders to submit special weather reports to carry out and rescue service for airstrikes coming in and around the Japanese main coast. In that departure, they were warned that there were Japanese submarines operating in the area. And ultimately it was deduced that the USS Kite was sunk off of Okinawa by a Japanese submarine. That submarine, which was determined to be RO-41, was also sunk later by a U.S. destroyer as a point of confirmation. On USS Tullabee, on 5 March 44, the Tullabee was commanded and left Pearl on her 4th war patrol. She was to operate in the area north of Palau. The following is a story of Tullabee's losses taken from a statement made by the lone survivor. He reports that the boat arrived on station on 25 March. They then went to Periscope Depth and attacked a group of freighters, and the destroyers came over in the area. She fired 2 torpedoes. A minute or 2 later, a terrific concussion shook the boat, and the survivor, who had been on the bridge for duty, soon found himself struggling in the water, and they figured out that it was a circular run on the torpedo, much in the same fashion as USS Tang had been lost. He was able to get off the boat and was later spotted by the Japanese escort vessels that started to fire on him. However, he survived that, and they picked him up, and he was in prison for the rest of the war. USS Trigger. USS Trigger left Guam on March 11th, 1945. Ultimately, the Trigger was credited with 27 ships sunk on its 12 war patrols, 180,000 tons, 13 ships damaged for another 100,000 tons on its career. The Trigger was built in Mare Island and had 5 commanding officers. The initial commanding officer was Jack Lewis. He was a more traditional commanding officer. They made a couple of war patrols, but had no sinkings. The second commanding officer was Roy Benson. Third was Fritz Harlfinger. Fourth was Dusty Donan. And the fifth was my father, David Canola. Jack Lewis, the first commanding officer, was based out of Alaska initially, and they ultimately had a problem and actually ran aground trying to come into Midway. But that's another story. Roy Benson was a long-time commanding officer. He was a graduate of 1929 Naval Academy, served on the R boats, O boats, S boats, and finally a fleet, which was Trigger. Roy was involved with a number of new techniques. They had, of course, the torpedo problems, and part of their poor history in firing torpedoes, they were part of, hopefully, the solution that came back, bringing the torpedoes that didn't work and identifying their problems. And as it relates to that, I brought in a souvenir that's left over. I'll ask David and Luke to step over and show that souvenir. Here's a photograph, I've shared it before with you all, of the submarine that had come in, where they thought they had sunk a Japanese aircraft carrier, the HIYO, H-I-Y-O. And here's the photograph that they took of their battle flag that was the reward that they said they got it. Here's the Trigger, 4 hits, and that's what they thought they had gotten. However, lousy torpedoes. They only actually got 1 to explode in the stern end of the aircraft carrier. This was off of, thank you guys. The HIYO had been rebuilt, had come out of Tokyo Bay, and there they were. Their Trigger sat outside of that, fired 4, and they only got 1 hit, which which was in the stern end, and ultimately they had to tow the aircraft carrier back in. So it took it out of service for a while. So that was some of the fun things. Roy kept that flag, and after the war donated it to the U.S. Naval Academy Museum. That museum, over a period of time, has collected a mammoth amount of memorabilia items. And about 2 years ago, I got a note from the museum that they were going to return his flag that he had donated to them in 1946. So, thank you.
Yeah, very cool.
Of course, the on board with Roy.
It's sewn out of their uniforms. That's the pants. You could tell.
Oh,
it's
okay.
the denim they used for the letters.
Wow.
It's all hand stitched too. Yeah.
So of course, with Roy was Ned Beach, served as a junior officer on his student. Roy was instructor at the Naval Academy, taught Ned navigation, and then they hooked up ultimately on Trigger for their service. Ned wrote a lot of stories, one of which was Unlucky in June, USS Heo, and his story is all about that, how they thought they had it, and then they didn't have it. So that was part of it. Also, Roy was famous for laying mines. At the beginning of the war, they were both short of torpedoes, or torpedoes that worked. And there's a story where they loaded up the Trigger forward torpedo tubes with mines. And the crew, of course, didn't like that. They wanted to fire torpedoes, of course. But anyway, they went off a key point off the Japanese coast and laid their mines there. And as they finished off doing that, in comes a freighter and a destroyer escort coming down the coast. They immediately went out and watched. And as Roy later said, I'm probably the only guy that ever laid a minefield and actually saw its results. And sure enough, the freighter comes in, hits one of the mines, explodes, and sinks the freighter. Well, now the destroyer escort is saying, there's a submarine around here firing torpedoes. And now started going back and forth. And Roy says, how that destroyer ever survives the minefield, he'll never know. But ultimately gave up, and the destroyer went one way, and Trigger went the other way. The other commanding officer, Fritz Hallfinger, I've met him down here in Florida in his retirement. He was retired as a rear admiral. Dusty Dornan was in very aggressive, almost the likes of Mush Morton on Wahoo. And a lot of the success in the boat sunk by Trigger, Dornan got a big handful of those ships that were done. In March of 45, my father, Dave Knoll, class of 36 out of the Naval Academy, took out the boat, and essentially, after topping off out of Guam, was never really heard from again, except to acknowledge the formation of a wolf pack. At that point, in mid-March, early April, was the beginning of our attack on Okinawa. And ultimately, one of the things they wanted to know about was the last Japanese battleship that was in existence at that time. That was the Yamato, and she was up in Bungo, Sweden, and they were getting ready to bring her out. And they had her fleet group of destroyer escorts getting ready to go. Well, at that point, they were communicating, of course, by radio, and thus we had broken the Japanese code. We knew, in general, Yamato was coming out, but they wanted to know specifically when. So they formed a wolf pack called Earl's Eliminators. 3 boats, the Sea Dog, the Threadfin, and Trigger. And they lined them up, Trigger first, Threadfin, and Sea Dog, outside of the harbor. And ultimately, Trigger went in harm's way, shallow, and was observed submerged by an airplane that later reported it, called out a destroyer and 2 coastal defense, and they ultimately located Trigger. And after about 2 hours, they found a big oil slick that had come up, and she was gone. This was all found out, of course, from surviving Japanese records after the war. Interesting that one of the destroyers was the Maikura, and the Maikura, after sinking Trigger, went directly south, right into the way of Threadfin, who sunk Maikura. So there was some revenge there, if you will, after the fact. After the war, I was 6 months old when my dad was lost. There was a memorial service at the U.S. Naval Academy. I was living in Annapolis, Maryland with my grandparents. My mother was there working, and they had a memorial service afterwards at the Naval Academy. So this is one of the pictures that was taken of that occasion in 1946, roughly. And this was a replica of a battle flag of the USS Trigger. And the original battle flag is behind me, that they copied. And the battle flag that they presented to the Naval Academy Museum is still there today. We visit annually up there to meet the curator, etc., and we make sure to keep that flag up there, please. Well, at that ceremony, the 4 surviving commanding officers were there. And Roy Benson, a bachelor at the time, met my mother for the first time. They started dating a year later. They got married. Roy adopted me and took me along for the ride. He was in service for 40 years, retired as a rear admiral, made ComSub PAC, and I was a spoiled admiral's brat. Real quick, do it my best. I found the Trigger Maroon, the Galloping Ghost, the Japanese coast. This poem, I thought, is appropriate. It's given credit to a motor Mac on Trigger. However, they've taken a variation with other subs. I'm the Galloping Ghost of the Japanese coast. You don't hear of me and my crew. But just ask any man off the coast of Japan if he knows the Trigger Maroon. I look sleek and slender alongside my tender, with others like me at my side. But we'll tell you a story of battle and glory as enemy waters we ride. I've been stuck on a rock, felt the depth charges shock, been north to the place called Attu. And I've sunk me 2 freighters atop the equator, hot work, but the sea was cold blue. I've cruised close inshore and carried the war to the Empire Island Honshu. While they wire Yokohama, I could see Fujiyama, so I stayed to admire the view. When we rigged to run silently, deeply as I dived, and within me the heat was terrific. My men poured in sweat, silent and yet, cursed me and the whole damn Pacific. Then destroyers came sounding and depth charge pounding. My submarine crew took the test. Far in that far off island, there was no friends on hand to answer a call of distress. I was blasted and shaken, some damage I taken. My hull bleeds and pipelines too. I've come in from out there for machinery repair and the rest for me and my crew. I got by on cold nerve and in silence I served, though I took some hard knocks in return. One propeller shaft spun and my battery's done with the enemy ships I saw burn. I'm the Galloping Ghost of the Japanese coast. You don't hear of me and my crew, but just ask any man off the coast of Japan if he knows the Trigger Maroon. Thank you.
Thank you for your very informative meetings you have. And if he was my father, I would definitely be proud.
You bet. Thank you.
Have you written all that down?